Now, this is truly shocking stuff. We're talking about war crimes committed by the British Armed Forces in Afghanistan, and these war crimes are as grotesque and as shocking as it is imaginable to think up. We're talking about the murder of and the shooting of toddlers as they sleep. We're talking about just vicious, depraved murder of innocent civilians. And this has been covered up, and it tells us so much about the nature of not just British, but Western foreign policy in the so-called war on terror, and how this has directly led to and facilitated, enabled Israel's live stream genocide of the Palestinian people. It's so important we talk about this, and there's no better person to talk about this than Khem Rogaly, who is the co-director of Transition Security Project. That's a new research centre founded by Commonwealth and the Climate and Community Institute to investigate the US and UK military industrial complexes. Great to speak to you, Khem.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's a big honour. So what's happened this week?
So we've had the inquiry, the independent inquiry on British war crimes in Afghanistan has published some new evidence. And what we've seen is really a change in reporting to some extent in the kind of scale of reporting, because it's coming from these high-profile whistleblowers who had senior roles in the British Special Forces, and I think it's good for us to say that it's shocking in one way, because I think we should always be shocked by the kind of the level of brutality of these crimes. We're talking about systemic extrajudicial killings. We're talking about people being detained as a pretext in order to shoot them. We're talking about toddlers who were shot in their beds while they were sleeping at night, and their parents were shot in their heads and killed next to them by British soldiers. And those toddlers who are now teenagers today are still living with the bullets inside their bodies that they haven't been able to be removed, and they've caused lasting damage to their lives. That's the sort of crime that we're talking about. We're also talking about the kind of abuse of detainees. So on the one level, I think we can never forget how shocking, how brutal this type of violence is. But I also think that we're not shocked in another way. We're not surprised, because this has been known about throughout the so-called war on terror. From the moment of the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and interventions across West Asia and the Middle East, we've known about British and American forces committing atrocities and committing war crimes. The shooting of those two toddlers in Afghanistan was reported on Afghan Newswire the day after it happened. These war crimes were being reported back to Downing Street at the time that they took place. And yet they were not of interest to the media in this country until we had whistleblowers at this level. And I think the other point that we should be really clear on is that while there is obviously very, very clear evidence coming from the highest level of both the atrocities committed by the SAS, by the British Special Forces in Afghanistan, this was a wider and systemic issue across the kind of British military and intelligence infrastructure that was collaborating with the US in these crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan over that whole period of the so-called war on terror.
It's really striking to talk about the SAS, because that, the SAS are glorified in British popular culture, aren't they? Kind of they're presented as kind of these sexy, daring, James Bond-esque figures. You get TV shows, films, all the rest of it. In a sense, that kind of glorification is part of the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think all of these documents are available to read online. You can read the testimonies and accounts of these crimes on the inquiry's website. And if you do read them, what you see is that the kind of myth of these, kind of the horrible myth of these strapping James Bond types kind of coming down from helicopters is actually hiding a very banal and kind of disgusting reality of people playing games with how many civilians can I kill? How many so-called fighting age men can I frame as supposedly legitimate targets and shoot them in their heads, or blindfolding people and just killing them while you've captured them as they were sleeping. There's an account, for instance, as well of one soldier forcing another to let him kill a civilian with a knife because he wants to get blood on his knife. It's real atrocities that we're talking about, and I think that there's something kind of almost barbaric in it, and it really kind of it feels like the reality of the kind of terrorism and barbarism that we're so often told about in the West is ourselves, and we need to understand that.
I think it's such a striking point, because obviously in the so-called war on terror, we got the endemic dehumanization of Muslims, the Islamophobia, which was used to justify the so-called war on terror, with a focus on, for example, atrocities committed by ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which were then extrapolated, basically. Is this a problem within Islam? And, is this a problem? This is an existential, threat to us by Muslims. If those sorts of atrocities you talked about, if they were committed by an ISIS figure, they would be regarded as, here's an example of this unbelievable extreme sadism. Or the Taliban, for example, would be used to justify the occupation in the first place. But, so there's this denial, isn't there? There's this kind of, atrocities when perpetrated by forces ranged against the West, then they become kind of splashed over front pages, an example of this unique, unparalleled evil, whilst when they're committed by British troops, there's just cover up.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting about this is obviously we're hearing about this now, 10, 15 years after the specific crimes that are being talked about have been committed. But obviously what the war on terror did, the so-called war on terror, was really kind of put into clear and consistent practice, this kind of imperial intervention, which obviously the British has been schooled at and kind of led the world in for many decades, as have the Americans. And while they were committing these war crimes and not being held accountable under the kind of regimes of international law that tend to protect Western states, they really opened the space for their allies to do the same. And we've just been living through a kind of a new form of criminality and a live stream genocide committed by Israel with the total collaboration of the British military throughout. So that kind of dehumanization has fed directly into what we've just lived through. But I also think the lack of accountability and the kind of the fact that the world system has been led by states openly committing these war crimes that we've known about but kind of not had held to account, has allowed them now to kind of support a new level of genocide, of ethnic cleansing and of occupation in Gaza. And I think what's really interesting is kind of on the one hand, we have this pretty clear-eyed reporting that's coming out, even from the BBC, that they have been reporting on this. Even the Sunday Times release some of these documents. But then when it comes to British spy flights that are being flown over Gaza daily throughout a genocide in collaboration with Israel, the use of the British colonial base on Cyprus. This is like colonial land that was agreed in the decolonization of Cyprus that's used by the British and the Americans to supply the Israelis. The British bombing of Yemen throughout last year in collaboration with the Americans, killing civilians purely to protect and shield Israel from accountability for its genocide. All of that, is barely reported by the mainstream media, or it's covered up and clouded as much as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of Afghanistan, obviously the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was portrayed at the time as this kind of liberation, basically. And it was lots of humanitarian kind of justifications for it about the rights of women and so on. But what's striking is war crimes committed by both British, American and other occupied forces began from the beginning. And we often, what we sometimes got is reporting of Afghanistan with a kind of gathering insurgency, a kind of resurgence of the Taliban, which essentially evaporated in 2001 and then reconstituted. I mean, in large part because of the atrocities that were being committed against Afghan civilians, which caused growing numbers of people in Afghanistan to support the insurgency. But there was no context for that given in the Western media. So you just basically got this portrayal of kind of, the Taliban are back because of kind of, mass religious extremism and fervor and all the rest of it. There was no context about how the war crimes that the West were ignoring were driving ordinary people in Afghanistan into the arms of anyone who would take up arms against the people committing the atrocities.
War crimes and massive societal destruction as well. I mean, if you look at the data compiled by the Costs of War Project at Brown University, they look at the US-led post 9/11 wars as a whole, including obviously Iraq and Afghanistan, and they find that in direct war-related forms, nearly 1 million people were killed in those wars. If you include the destruction of economies, the destruction of healthcare systems, the destruction of environments and food systems, that number rises above 4 million people. Yep. So we're looking at massive levels of killing, massive levels of societal destruction from these interventions by British military, US, and their allies. And I think it's not surprising, obviously, that when you do that, it completely destabilizes societies, it destabilizes economies. Of course, it creates opposition. And I think what's important to think about there as we kind of attempt to reckon with the devastating legacy of these interventions. It's far too late. It's kind of horrific that it's not reckoned with much more in our politics. But even if we try to do that I think is really important for understanding debates about British military power today, because we're living through a moment where what we have is a kind of global British military with bases across the world, bases in the Middle East, as I said, supplying genocide, as I said, bombing Yemen. And now we're being pushed into ever higher and higher spending on that by the US. A massive military expansion, a doubling of its budget. We're looking at spending tens of billions of pounds more every year on the military. It's kind of barely spoken about within the kind of debates you have around public spending and the budget. And this is all to support a global force. And yet it's framed to us as we need this to defend ourselves, to defend our country from imminent attack. And what I think that says to me, the fact that, we keep these bases in Oman and Bahrain, we keep a base in the Indian Ocean that was potentially going to be used by the US to bomb Iran. And obviously we have that base on Cyprus. None of that is left open for debate. None of those spending decisions are questioned. And that whole legacy of intervention is just kind of left open as we expand our military power further and further.
I mean, I'm just interested in that point you make, obviously, about how this is systemic, about how this is not just about Afghanistan, but British foreign military policy throughout the so-called war on terror. Because often you got a narrative which you did get indulged by British media outlets, was this idea of, well, yes, the Americans can go over the top when, there's Abu Ghraib, there's Guantanamo, and they're kind of, kind of stereotypical kind of, macho American soldiers who just don't always play by the rules, but the British are this kind of professionalized army who aren't the kind of hot-headed Americans. But this is not actually what's happened, is it? In terms of what British armed forces have done, not just in Afghanistan, but for example in Iraq, and as you say, Yemen and elsewhere.
Exactly. And I think, if we're to look at the case of the special forces as is unfolding now in Afghanistan, what's happened is there's been this waiting by the media for military whistleblowers to come forward. But if we're actually to listen to the accounts of Iraqi civilians and Iraqi detainees that came throughout the war on terror, what we can see is that the British military were just as involved as the Americans in the abuse of prisoners, in these kinds of war crimes. You had British military prison in Basra that was full of atrocities, for instance. And I think it's really important to understand that you had hundreds of Iraqis come forward with their accounts of abuse at the hands of British forces throughout the past decades. And those have not been taken up. Those have not had the kind of the level of exposure or really any form of accountability. Even if you look at the kind of preliminary findings of the International Criminal Court that were published in 2020, they acknowledged that there were British war crimes against Iraqis, including extensive accounts of sexual abuse. And again, that's something that we hear about as being kind of perpetrated by the other side, but never so much kind of from the West onto other people. And those accounts of sexual abuse, despite being reported as credible by the ICC, were never fully taken up as a proper ICC investigation. That investigation has not continued. People are not going to be prosecuted as a result. So this is a kind of systemic part of British policy. And I guess where I want to finish on that, because obviously it's Iraq, it's Afghanistan, it's Libya, it's Yemen, it's elsewhere, is that this isn't just a case of soldiers and members of the armed forces who've kind of gone rogue, or intelligence officers kind of acting in a kind of gang-like way in these kind of prisons and architecture of the war on terror. This was known at the highest level of politics. Obviously, you had the Labour politicians who sanctioned our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But you also had, if you look at the Afghanistan case, these were crimes being reported to David Cameron's Downing Street. And it's likely that this was known about at the very, very highest level. And where is the accountability going to be for that? If we see prosecutions of soldiers, are we also going to see prosecutions of politicians? Are we going to see prosecutions of civil servants and military lawyers who were doing the bureaucratic work of enabling these crimes as well?
I mean, and that is that crucial point you make about how this lack of a reckoning enables, for example, the road to the genocide, the live stream genocide that Israel has committed against the Palestinian people. Because actually, what Israel has done, obviously, is one of the great crimes of our age. But what is feeding into it is, the so-called war on terror and the horrors which the allies of Israel, Britain and the United States, have committed without a reckoning. And because there wasn't a reckoning, and because the Western media at the time covered these up, I know you say now, well, they get covered and, it's long after the event, portrayed as being in the past and not given due prominence or treated as a national scandal. It's not front page news, it's not leading the bulletins. So that lack of a reckoning is how we end up, for example, isn't it, in the killing fields of Gaza, which has been wiped from the face of the earth.
It's total dehumanization. And I think we have to ask ourselves a question as a society, how we can be in a place where hundreds of people through the genocide, you'd often go through weeks where hundreds of people were being killed every single day by the Israelis with the total collaboration of the US and European powers. And that was just something that was kind of in the day-to-day of media reporting, in the day-to-day of politics. It was barely being discussed, it was barely being picked up, and it was not something that was really being confronted. And that can only happen when you dehumanize people as another, when you don't consider their lives to be as important as British lives. Compare the obvious case of the killing of British aid workers by the Israelis to the killing of Palestinians by the Israelis. People are not seen as people. They're not treated in the fullness of their lives. They are just made into numbers and dehumanized. And that is how we end up in a situation where genocide can be permitted. And I think also we should think about, for instance, if we're to map that across, obviously the war on terror was something that was kind of encouraged, although they were not at all the leading players. It was very much kind of US-led effort. The senior Israeli politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, have been pushing for so many years this kind of dehumanization of Muslims, and we see it now as well. Whenever there's an opportunity, the Israeli government will come out with a line that says, this is why Palestinians are a threat to the West. This is why they're part of some kind of terror network. And that kind of dehumanization continues and is being pushed. And it is what enables the murder of people today.
I should say, although here there's an intentional great forgetting, people do not forget in the places, the countries, the nations which have suffered this violence. I was in Baghdad in August, and when, for example, one Iraqi man was told I was British, he looked me in the face and said, "You've destroyed this country." That anger is extremely raw and real. Just finally, what does this, in terms of, because as you mentioned, this whole discourse about Britain, its role in the world, the discourse on defence, what are the great lessons that people should take from this?
Well, I think we really need to look at defence and foreign policy in the round. And I think about this in relation to kind of questions that Zach Polanski and Zara Sultana have been answering recently on this, in that they've often gone back to kind of old school left questions of, do we leave NATO now? Do we abolish nuclear weapons now? And actually, I think what we need is something far more structural. Realistically, if a party on the left or a movement on the left is ever to come into power, they're not on the first day in power going to leave NATO. It's not kind of possible policy trajectory that they can take. But what they can do is completely revise the role of Britain in the world and reckon with this disastrous legacy of the war on terror, of imperialism and imperial intervention. And what I mean by that is looking at how the British military is currently constituted as a global power, whether it's being deployed to the South China Sea to have this kind of supposed competition with China that is kind of almost laughable at this point, or whether it's these bases that we have in the Middle East that are used for genocide and for military intervention, whether it's the base that we're paying for to be used by the US in the Indian Ocean. That needs to be reckoned with. And what we need is basically to completely restructure our military. So it's no longer this force for kind of the global projection of power, but thought of as something that's genuinely for the national defense of this country. And it could be involved in multilateral security collaboration. It could be involved in things like what the Spanish government has instituted, which is basically a force that is not there for fighting in conflict, but is literally just there to manage emergency relief and natural disasters. So it could be thinking about things like addressing the climate crisis as well. But what that requires is almost two things at the same time. One is thinking about the role of Britain in the world, thinking about its disastrous legacy, and reconstituting ourselves rather than trying to be a global military power to just having a military that defends the country. That's one part. But the other is also redefining what security means, taking it away from this kind of geopolitical definition that is about posturing with the US on the world stage. It's about hurting other countries through military interventions, and thinking about security in people's everyday lives, in our cost of living, in our bills, in the cost of housing, and also our safety amid a planetary crisis, a climate crisis. And what we can do if we're no longer spending all this money on having a global military is have both a national defense, a force that's committed to genuine national defense, and at the same time release public resources, because we have these tens of billions of pounds a year that are now going to go into meeting an arbitrary NATO target. We can release those resources to fund people's everyday security and help them manage the cost of living.
Brilliant stuff. So crucial, this, and it's so important that awareness of what has been the terrible crimes that have been committed is understood, but also the actual implications of that and where we go from here, given the crimes which are being committed by Western forces every single day, which I'm afraid my industry is complicit in and helps facilitate with its silence and whitewashing. So for everyone watching, press like, subscribe, leave your comments, leave your thoughts. Love to hear as ever. Share the video, get the message out. But Khem, honestly, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Owen.